Blood trickled down the side of Vaughn Jeffords' weathered face as he slumped against the sun-bleached wall of his isolated cabin, pressing a whiskey-soaked rag to the fresh wound Sheriff Williams had just stitched closed, another reminder that a man with no ties to anyone lived with only the promise of a lonely grave. "That's the third time in 2 months I've patched you up, Jeffords," Sheriff Williams remarked, packing up his medical supplies. The older lawman's eyes, faded blue beneath bushy gray brows, studied the younger man with a mixture of concern and judgment. "You keep riding alone, taking on outlaws without backup, you'll wind up dead in some canyon with nobody to mourn you but the buzzards." Vaughn took a swig from his bottle, wincing as the alcohol burned his throat. "Got no one to mourn me anyway, Sheriff. Might as well make my time count." The sheriff shook his head, the late afternoon sun of 1875 slanting through the cabin's lone window, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. "That's what worries me. Every man needs something to live for, not just something to die for." "Well, I ain't found it yet," Vaughn replied, his voice low and graveled from years of dust and solitude. At 32, the former Texas Ranger had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. The war between the states had taken his brother, bounty hunting had taken his friends, and time had taken everything else. Sheriff Williams paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "Where you're going, Jeffords, you'll die alone in this cabin. Mark my words." Vaughn didn't bother responding. The door closed, and he was once again embraced by the silence that had become his only faithful companion in the 5 years since he'd settled in the small town of Redemption, Arizona Territory. The cabin was sparse: a bed, a table, a trunk of belongings, and a few shelves lined with books he rarely read anymore. Outside, the vast desert stretched toward the distant mountains, beautiful but merciless, much like life itself. He dozed fitfully, the pain in his side from the bullet graze keeping him in that hazy place between sleep and wakefulness. The outlaws he'd tracked had gotten closer than he'd like to admit. 3 men dead, 1 wounded and in jail, and Vaughn with another scar to add to his collection. When morning came, he saddled his horse despite the pain. Staying still meant thinking, and thinking was more dangerous than any outlaw. He rode toward town, the early October air carrying the first hint of the coming winter. Redemption was a growing settlement, not large enough to attract the railroad yet, but substantial enough to have a hotel, a bank, a general store, and of course, 3 saloons. Vaughn tethered his horse outside Harlow's general store and stepped inside, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor. "Morning, Mr. Jeffords," old man Harlow called from behind the counter. "Heard about your run-in with the Carson gang. Town's grateful." Vaughn nodded curtly. "Just need some supplies." He collected what he needed in silence: coffee, beans, bacon, ammunition when the door opened, allowing sunlight to flood the dim interior. "Oh my goodness, it's so good to finally reach town," a woman's voice said, causing Vaughn to turn instinctively. She stood in the doorway, removing dusty gloves from slender hands. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a practical bun, though wayward strands framed a face that, while tired, carried a determination that caught Vaughn's attention immediately. She was perhaps in her late 20s, and despite the trail dust covering her simple blue dress, there was an undeniable elegance to her bearing. "Mrs. Granger!" Harlow exclaimed, coming around the counter. "We'd begun to worry. Your uncle's letter said to expect you weeks ago." "The journey took longer than anticipated," she replied. "Traveling with children makes for slow progress, especially when the stagecoach breaks an axle 20 miles out." As if summoned by her words, 3 children appeared behind her: a boy of about 10 with serious eyes, a girl who looked around 7 with her mother's brown hair, and a younger boy no more than 4 who clung to his mother's skirts. "Sophia Granger," she introduced herself, extending her hand to Harlow. "And these are my children, Thomas, Eleanor, and James. Your uncle's place is ready for you," Harlow said. "Though I'm afraid it's quite basic and a fair distance from town." "Basic is fine," she replied with a tired smile. "After 2 months of travel, anything with a roof will seem luxurious." Vaughn found himself staring, an uncommon lapse in his usually guarded demeanor. When her eyes met his, he quickly looked away, resuming his gathering of supplies. "Mr. Jeffords," Harlow called. "You're headed back to your place, aren't you? That's in the direction of the old Miller property where Mrs. Granger will be staying." Before Vaughn could formulate a refusal, Harlow continued. "Mrs. Granger and her children have traveled all the way from Boston after her uncle's passing. The poor woman's been widowed nearly a year now." Sophia Granger straightened her shoulders. "We don't wish to impose on anyone. If you could point us in the right direction, it's 5 miles. Vaughn found himself saying, "Rough country. Nightfall's coming." He hesitated, then added, "I can take you." She studied him for a long moment, her brown eyes wary but desperate. "Thank you, Mr. Jeffords. We'd be most grateful." An hour later, Vaughn found himself leading a borrowed wagon carrying Sophia Granger, her 3 children, and their meager belongings along the dusty trail toward her uncle's abandoned homestead. The children were remarkably quiet, their eyes wide as they took in the unfamiliar landscape of mesas and sagebrush. "Your uncle's place," Vaughn said, breaking the long silence as they approached a small cabin set against a rocky outcropping. "Been empty about 3 years now. When he wrote inviting us to come west after Charles, my husband, passed, I never imagined I wouldn't see him again," Sophia said softly. "The letter about his passing reached Boston just as we were preparing to leave." Vaughn nodded but offered no words of comfort. What could he say? Life took, and rarely gave back. The cabin was in better shape than he'd expected. Miller had been a careful man, and the structure remained sound. Inside was dusty but intact 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, shelves, a table, and beds that needed only fresh linens. "It's perfect," Sophia declared, though Vaughn noted the brief flicker of dismay in her eyes as she took in the isolation and simplicity of what would now be their home. "There's a good well out back," he said, carrying in their trunks. "And the roof doesn't leak. Miller was particular about that." The boy, Thomas, followed him outside, watching as Vaughn checked the perimeter. "Are there Indians?" the boy asked suddenly. "Apache," Vaughn corrected. "And yes, but they keep to themselves if you do the same." "Will wild animals come at night?" Vaughn looked down at the boy's serious face. "Coyotes sometimes. Maybe a mountain lion passing through." "Your ma know how to shoot?" Thomas shook his head. "Then that's something she'll need to learn." Vaughn unloaded the last of their supplies. "Town's 5 miles that way. I'm 2 miles that way," he added, pointing northeast. "If there's trouble, fire 3 shots." Sophia appeared in the doorway, her youngest on her hip. "Mr. Jeffords, we're more grateful than I can express." He nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I'll check back in a few days. Make sure you're settled." As he mounted his horse, the little girl Eleanor ran up to him. "Thank you, mister," she said, offering him a small wooden doll. "For keeping the bad things away." Vaughn stared at the doll, then at the girl's earnest face. "Keep it," he said gruffly. "You might need it more than me." He rode away without looking back, ignoring the unfamiliar feeling in his chest, something almost like concern for people other than himself. 3 days passed before Vaughn admitted to himself that he was going to check on the Grangers. He told himself it was merely neighborly obligation in harsh country, nothing more. He heard the crying before he saw the cabin. The youngest boy sat on the front step, tears streaming down his face, while Sophia struggled with an axe, attempting to split wood for the fireplace. Vaughn dismounted in one fluid motion. "Mrs. Granger!" She startled, nearly dropping the axe. "Mr. Jeffords! I didn't hear you approach." Her hands were blistered, her dress smudged with dirt. The determination in her eyes, however, remained undimmed. "You're holding it wrong," he said, nodding toward the axe. "You'll break your back before you split a decent log." "I've never had occasion to chop wood in Boston," she admitted. "But we need the fire. The nights are getting colder." Without another word, Vaughn took the axe from her hands. With efficient movements, he began splitting the logs she had gathered. In minutes, he had created a pile that would last several days. Thank you, she said, her voice tight with what might have been pride or embarrassment. We're still adapting. The little boy had stopped crying, watching Vaughn with wide eyes. Are you a real cowboy? He asked. James, Sophia admonished. Don't bother Mr. Jeffords with questions. I was a ranger once, Vaughn answered, surprising himself. Now I just hunt bounties sometimes. Like bad men? The boy asked, eyes widening further. Vaughn nodded, uncomfortable with the hero worship already forming in the child's gaze. Mr. Jeffords, would you join us for supper? Sophia asked suddenly. It's not much, just beans and biscuits, but it's the least we can offer for your help. His instinct was to refuse. Involvement meant complication, and complication inevitably led to pain. But the fading sunlight caught the warm brown of her eyes, and he found himself nodding. I could show you how to set snares, he offered. For rabbits. Good meat if you're not squeamish. We're learning not to be squeamish about much of anything these days, she replied with a small smile that did something peculiar to Vaughn's pulse. Inside, the cabin had been transformed. Simple calico curtains hung at the windows, the floors had been swept, and the children's few toys were arranged neatly in a corner. Thomas and Eleanor returned from collecting water, their eyes growing round at the sight of Vaughn in their home. Dinner was indeed simple, but the biscuits were fresh and the company unexpectedly pleasant. The children, initially shy, gradually peppered him with questions about the territory, about snakes and scorpions, about his horse and his gun. Children, let Mr. Jeffords eat in peace, Sophia finally intervened. It's fine, Vaughn said, surprising himself again. He couldn't remember the last time he'd spoken so much in one sitting. As darkness fell, he rose to leave. I'll bring a rifle tomorrow, he said. You should learn to use it. Sophia walked him to the door. Mr. Jeffords, I want you to know that we don't expect charity. I'll find a way to pay for the rifle and any other assistance. It's not charity, he replied. It's survival. Out here, neighbors help neighbors because otherwise, no one makes it through winter. She studied him for a long moment. Are we neighbors then? The question seemed to hold more weight than its simple words suggested. I suppose we are, he answered finally. The next morning, Vaughn returned with an old Winchester rifle, some ammunition, and a book on local plants that might be useful for a woman trying to establish a garden in the harsh soil. He found Sophia already at work, clearing a small patch beside the cabin. You're determined, he observed. She straightened, brushing hair from her forehead. I have to be. My children depend on me now. What brought you out here? He asked, setting down the rifle. Boston to Arizona territory is a long way to come. Sophia leaned on her makeshift hoa branch with a metal blade attached. After Charles died of fever, we had nothing. His gambling debts took our home, our savings. My uncle's letter came at the moment I was most desperate. She gazed at the distant mountains. He wrote of open spaces where a person could breathe, where land could be claimed, where my children might grow up free from the shadow of their father's mistakes. And now I wonder if I've made a terrible mistake, she admitted, her voice barely audible. But we have nowhere else to go, so we must make this work. Vaughn found himself wanting to reassure her, an unfamiliar impulse. Land's hard but fair. It gives back what you put in. She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face. That's what I'm counting on, Mr. Jeffords. Vaughn, he said suddenly. My name is Vaughn. Vaughn, she repeated, and somehow, in her mouth, his name sounded different, like it belonged to someone worth knowing. They spent the morning with the rifle, Vaughn showing her how to load, aim, and fire. She was a quick study, her hands steady once she overcame her initial fear of the weapon. By midday, she could hit a can placed on a fence post at 20 paces. Not bad, he acknowledged. Practice every day. Thomas too, when he's a bit older. I never imagined I'd be learning to shoot rifles in the wilderness, she said, carefully setting the weapon aside. In Boston, I played the piano and arranged flowers. Different skills for different lives, Vaughn replied. You adapt or you don't survive. And you? What were you before you became so adapted to this life? The question caught him off guard. No one in Redemption asked about his past anymore. I was a soldier. Then a ranger. Then nothing in particular. I don't believe that, she said quietly. No one is nothing in particular. Before he could respond, Thomas came running from the cabin. Ma! Eleanor's got a fever! The next hours passed in a blur of concern. Eleanor's skin burned hot to the touch, her small body racked with chills despite the blankets Sophia piled upon her. Vaughn rode to town for the doctor, only to find he was away delivering a baby at a ranch 10 miles in the opposite direction. Willow bark tea helps bring down fever, he told Sophia upon his return, remembering something his mother had taught him long ago. There's a stand of willows by the creek. Through the night, they took turns sitting with Eleanor, coaxing sips of the bitter tea between her parched lips. By dawn, the fever had broken, leaving the child exhausted but cooler to the touch. Sophia, slumped in a chair beside the bed, had dark circles beneath her eyes. You should rest, Vaughn said softly. I'll watch her. Sophia shook her head. I can't leave her. You're no good to any of your children if you collapse, he insisted. Just an hour. I promise I'll wake you if anything changes. Finally, she nodded, moving to the other bed in the small room. Within minutes, she was asleep. Vaughn sat in the quiet cabin, watching the steady rise and fall of Eleanor's chest, listening to the soft breathing of Sophia across the room. Something inside him shifted, like the ground during a tremor subtle but significant, rearranging what had seemed solid and unchangeable. When Sophia woke, the sun was high. She bolted upright, immediately looking toward Eleanor. She's better, Vaughn assured her. Had some water and went back to sleep. Fever stayed down. Relief washed over Sophia's face. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know what we would have done without your help. Any neighbor would have done the same, he replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. She rose, smoothing her rumpled dress. No. Most would not have stayed through the night or known about willow bark tea. You're a good man, Vaughn Jeffords, despite whatever you might believe about yourself. Her words made him uncomfortable, and he busied himself checking on Eleanor to avoid meeting Sophia's eyes. The little girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Mama? She called weakly. I'm here, darling, Sophia said, rushing to her side. How do you feel? Thirsty, Eleanor whispered. And my head hurts. That's to be expected after such a fever, Sophia soothed, stroking her daughter's hair. Mr. Jeffords has been helping take care of you. Eleanor's gaze shifted to Vaughn. Like a guardian angel? The question startled a rough laugh from him. No, child. Nothing like that. But you watched over me while I was sleeping, she insisted with a child's logic. That's what angels do. Vaughn had no response for that. He stood, suddenly feeling like an intruder in the intimate family moment. I should go. Things to tend to. Sophia followed him to the door. Will you come back tomorrow? The children would like to thank you properly. He hesitated, knowing he should maintain his distance, knowing the wisest course was to retreat to his solitary existence. I'll check on the rabbit snares I set, he said finally. Show Thomas how to reset them. Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. We'll have supper waiting. And so began a pattern that would slowly reshape Vaughn's life. Every few days, he would ride to the Granger cabin, always with a purpose to repair the roof, to show Thomas how to mend fences, to bring meat from a successful hunt. Sophia would insist he stay for a meal, and increasingly, he found reasons not to refuse. The children grew comfortable with his presence. James would run to greet him, begging for rides on his shoulders. Eleanor would show him her drawings or the wildflowers she'd collected. Thomas watched his every move with serious eyes, eager to learn everything Vaughn could teach about survival and the territory. And Sophia, she changed too. The strain that had marked her face upon arrival gradually eased. She learned to manage the garden, to preserve food for the coming winter, to shoot with increasing accuracy. Her laughter came more readily, especially in the evenings when they all sat around the fireplace, and Vaughn found himself sharing stories he hadn't thought about in years. Winter arrived with a suddenness that caught even Vaughn by surprise. The first snowfall blanketed the territory in white silence, making the trip between cabins more treacherous. Still, he went, telling himself it was his duty to ensure they had enough firewood, enough supplies. On Christmas Eve, he arrived to find the cabin transformed. Pine boughs decorated the windows, and handmade ornaments hung from a small juniper tree in the corner. The children had created paper chains and drawings to brighten the walls, and the smell of something sweet filled the air. "Vaughn!" Sophia exclaimed when he entered, flour on her cheeks and hands. "We weren't sure you'd make it through the snow." "Wouldn't miss it," he said, surprising himself with the truth of the statement. He produced a burlap sack from behind his back. "Brought some things." The children gathered around as he distributed his simple gifts: a carved wooden horse for James, a proper sketchbook and pencils for Eleanor, and a small pocket knife for Thomas, who accepted it with solemn pride. "I have something for you as well," Sophia said, disappearing into the back room. She returned with a package wrapped in brown paper. "It isn't much." Inside was a knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "You made this?" he asked, running his fingers over the soft material. She nodded. "During the evenings, after the children were asleep. The nights get cold." That night, as they ate the simple feast, Sophia had prepared rabbit stew, cornbread, and precious apples she'd been saving for the occasion. Vaughn realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd celebrated Christmas. The war had taken such traditions from him, along with so much else. Yet here, in this small cabin with this makeshift family, something long dormant stirred back to life. As the children fell asleep beside the fire, Sophia and Vaughn sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames. "I have a confession," she said finally, her voice soft in the quiet room. "When we first arrived, I was terrified. I thought I'd made a terrible mistake bringing my children to such a wild place." "And now?" he asked. She looked at him, firelight reflecting in her eyes. "Now I think perhaps it was the first right decision I've made in a very long time." Snow continued to fall outside, insulating the cabin in hushed white. Vaughn found himself telling her about his life before, about his family in Texas, about his brother who never came home from the war, about the years of drifting that followed. She listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions but mostly allowing him the space to unburden himself of memories long suppressed. In turn, she spoke of her marriage to Charles Granger, a charming man who had swept her off her feet only to reveal a weakness for gambling and alcohol that eventually consumed him. She spoke of her fear when left alone with 3 children and no means of support, and of her determination to give them a better life, no matter the cost to herself. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," Vaughn told her, meaning every word. She laughed softly. "I'm just doing what any mother would do." "No," he insisted. "Most would have stayed where it was safe, where life was familiar. You crossed the continent on nothing but hope." "Hope and desperation," she amended. "Powerful motivators." The fire had burned low when Vaughn realized how late it had grown. "I should go," he said reluctantly. Sophia glanced at the window, where snow continued to fall heavily. "You can't ride in this. It's too dangerous in the dark." "I've weathered worse," he began, but she shook her head firmly. "We have plenty of room. The children would love to wake up and find you still here on Christmas morning." "Only the children?" he wondered, but didn't voice the thought. Instead, he nodded, accepting her offer of blankets to make a bed near the fire. Long after Sophia had retired to the back room with the children, Vaughn lay awake, listening to the wind outside and the occasional pop from the dying embers. For the first time in years, he felt a sensation that took him a while to identify: contentment. The realization both comforted and terrified him. Contentment meant attachment, and attachment meant vulnerability. Sheriff Williams' words echoed in his mind. "You'll die alone in this cabin." Was it possible that fate had a different plan? Or was this merely a temporary respite before life took away something else he cared about? Morning arrived with sunlight streaming through windows glazed with frost patterns. Vaughn woke to find James sitting beside him, examining his face with the unabashed curiosity of a child. "Santa didn't come," the boy announced. "No?" Vaughn asked, sitting up. "How do you know?" "Because I asked for a puppy, and there's no puppy," James replied matter-of-factly. Vaughn suppressed a smile. "Santa's sleigh probably got stuck in the snow. Puppies are hard to deliver in blizzards." The boy considered this explanation, then nodded, accepting its logic. "Maybe next year." "Maybe," Vaughn agreed, though he made no promises. Christmas Day passed in a blur of simple pleasures, the children's delight and the small gifts Sophia had managed to provide, a snowball fight outside that left everyone red-cheeked and laughing, hot chocolate made from carefully rationed supplies. Vaughn found himself fully participating, drawn into the family's joy despite his usual reserve. As dusk approached and the time came for him to leave, Sophia walked with him to where his horse was tethered. "Thank you for staying," she said. "It meant so much to the children. And to you?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. She looked up at him, snowflakes catching in her eyelashes. "Yes, Vaughn. To me most of all." He reached out, brushing a snowflake from her cheek. The touch lingered, his rough fingers against her smooth skin. Neither moved away. "Sophia," he began, uncertain what he wanted to say but knowing he needed to say something. "I know," she whispered, as if she truly did understand the tumult of emotions he couldn't express. "I feel it too." The kiss, when it came, was gentle, tentative at first, then deepening as they both surrendered to what had been building between them for months. Her lips were soft beneath his, her hands warm against his chest even through layers of winter clothing. When they finally parted, both breathless, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected this," he admitted. "Any of it." "Nor did I," she replied. "But perhaps that's how the best things happen, when we least expect them." The winter months passed with Vaughn spending more and more time at the Granger cabin. Together, they weathered storms both literal and figurative, a week of blizzards that left them snowbound, a bout of illness that swept through the children, the day James wandered too far and was missing for terrifying hours before Vaughn found him sheltering in a hollow tree. With each challenge met and overcome, the bonds between them strengthened. Vaughn, who had lived so long with only his own company, found himself craving the chaos and warmth of the Granger household when he was away. The cabin that had once seemed a sufficient shelter now felt empty, a mere structure rather than a home. Spring arrived with the promise of renewal. The garden Sophia had started the previous year began to show signs of life, and Vaughn helped expand it, turning the soil while she planted seeds saved from the fall harvest. Thomas proved adept at trapping, bringing home rabbits and even the occasional wild turkey. Eleanor's drawings captured the wild beauty of their surroundings with increasing skill, and James, now 5, chattered constantly about everything he observed in the awakening world around them. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Vaughn turned to Sophia. "I've been thinking," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant. She looked at him expectantly, the last rays of sunlight illuminating her face. The past months had changed her. She was tan now from working outdoors, stronger, more confident in her movements. Yet the gentle intelligence in her eyes remained the same, as did the quiet determination that had first caught his attention. "My cabin's bigger," he continued. "Better built. Closer to town for when the children start school." Sophia's breath caught, but she remained silent, waiting for him to finish. "I thought, that is, I hoped you might consider moving there. All of you." He paused, gathering courage. "As my family. If you'll have me." Her eyes filled with tears, but the smile that bloomed across her face was radiant. Are you asking me to marry you, Vaughn Jeffords? I am, he confirmed, taking her hand in his. I love you, Sophia. I love your children. I want to build a life with all of you, if that's what you want too. She laughed, a sound of pure joy. The children have been asking for weeks when we were all going to live together. Thomas said it was inefficient to maintain 2 cabins. Smart boy, Vaughn said, smiling. Is that a yes? In answer, she leaned forward and kissed him, her arms winding around his neck. Yes, she whispered against his lips. 1,000 times yes. They were married in the church in Redemption 3 weeks later. The entire town turned out for the occasion, curious to witness the transformation of the solitary bounty hunter into a family man. Sheriff Williams stood as Vaughn's best man, his weathered face creased in a broad grin. Never thought I'd see the day, he said as they waited for the bride to arrive. You proving me wrong about dying alone. Vaughn adjusted his unfamiliar suit collar. You and me both, Sheriff. When Sophia appeared at the back of the church, escorted by a proud Thomas, Vaughn felt his heart swell with an emotion too profound for words. Her dress was simple cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar, but to him, she had never looked more beautiful. Eleanor walked ahead, scattering wildflowers, while James carried the rings on a small cushion, his face solemn with the importance of his task. As they exchanged vows, Vaughn looked into Sophia's eyes and saw not just his present but his future reflected there, a future he had stopped believing was possible for a man like him. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the preacher declared, and as they sealed their union with a kiss, the church erupted in cheers. The celebration continued at their cabin, now truly their home, with neighbors bringing food and music. Children played in the yard, adults danced on the porch, and as twilight descended, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the gathering. Sheriff Williams approached them as they stood arm in arm, watching the festivities. Jeffords, he said, clapping Vaughn on the shoulder. I've never been happier to be wrong about a man. What changed your mind? Sophia asked, curious. The sheriff's eyes twinkled. First time I saw him ride into town after meeting you folks. Man had a purpose in his eyes that wasn't just about the next bounty or bottle. He tipped his hat to Sophia. You saved him, madam, though he might say it was the other way around. As the sheriff moved away, Sophia turned to Vaughn. Is that true? Did I save you? Vaughn looked at the home they had created together, at Thomas teaching the younger boys how to twirl the girls in a dance, at Eleanor showing her drawings to admiring neighbors, at the garden beginning to flourish under their combined care. We saved each other, he said simply. And that's the way it should be. Later, as the last guests departed and the children fell asleep, exhausted from the day's excitement, Vaughn and Sophia stood on the porch, her head resting against his shoulder as they gazed at the star-filled sky. What are you thinking? She asked softly. That I'm grateful, he replied. For you. For the children. For whatever twist of fate brought you to that general store on that particular day. She smiled up at him. Do you know what Thomas asked me this morning? He asked if he could call you Pa now that it's official. Emotion tightened Vaughn's throat. What did you tell him? That he should ask you himself, she answered. But I think you'll find all 3 of them have been practicing the word when you're not listening. Vaughn pulled her closer, overwhelmed by the gift he had been given, not just a wife, but a family, a purpose, a reason to wake each morning with hope rather than resignation. Mrs. Jeffords, he said, testing the sound of her new name, I believe we've proven the sheriff wrong in the best possible way. Sophia reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against the scar that had once marked his solitary battles. And we'll keep proving him wrong every day, for the rest of our lives. As they sealed this promise with a kiss, Vaughn knew with absolute certainty that the lonely death the sheriff had predicted had been replaced by something far more precious, a life filled with love, with purpose, with the daily joys and challenges of family. The cowboy who was supposed to die alone had found, against all odds, the very thing he hadn't known he was searching for. And as they walked hand in hand into their home, closing the door on the vast Arizona night, Vaughn Jeffords silently thanked whatever powers had brought Sophia Granger and her children into his life, changing its course forever.